Welcome to the Camunda BPM online training. Today we want to have a look at the Java API, the services we use to communicate with the engine, how to write your unit test in order to test your processes, and we want to discuss testing a little bit. I want to start with a demo. We will do most of the module live actually. So I want to start create a new project. I do a simple Maven project. We do a very simple one. We do it step by step. Training. You could use Maven archetypes. There are archetypes available. But as I said, we want to do it manually for now. So I use a var, a web application. It's the easiest one. I have to add a couple of dependencies. It's actually pretty easy. You need the Camunda engine. There it is. I use the 7.0 final, 7.1 final. Might be a different version when you watch this, but it's use the latest version you have. I want to have JUnit. JUnit is somewhere here, and I use the latest stable version here. Put it in test scope. I add H2 because the database, right? The latest version is fine on test because I want to use an in-memory database for my process engine. So that's actually all we need to get started. So what I can do, I can start with a simple unit test. So it's basically a test first approach. Process test case or the like. Don't care about packages for the moment. What we have is a JUnit for rule, so you can have a process engine rule. I think this has to be public actually, it's a requirement by JUnit. That's my rule, and I have to create a process engine rule. What you can already see is you can configure the process engine. If you use the default constructor, you have to have a Camunda CFG XML on the class path, or you can hand over the process engine. And this is actually what I want to do here because it's the easiest. So I can use standalone in-memory process engine configuration. Okay, that's one which is really perfect for test cases. I build the process engine, and yeah, that's it actually. That's my rule. Now we can write unit tests. I'll void test happy path. Okay. What I can do now from my rule, I get the process engine. Okay. Process engine. For a test case, we make it a unit test case. For a test case, we have some infrastructure in order to make that really, for the test case, deploy a process in that in-memory engine and undeploy it at the end. Okay, so what I do first, I create a new BPMN process model. I call it simple. Okay, so that's my simple process. I make it really simple. It starts and end event. Pretty important, if you create your new processes, you have to make sure they are executable. Otherwise, the engine ignores them. They need an ID. And I call it simple process. The name is actually only for the human in cockpit or whatever. But the process ID, that's really important. And there's a bit of confusion in the API, but remember, this is a process ID from the BPMN file. If I go to my process test case, I can say, okay, I want to have a deployment for this test case, and I deploy a couple of BPMN files. In this case, it's only the simple BPMN from the class path, simple BPMN. And now I'm able, in my test case with the process engine, we have a couple of services. This is now interesting. We can have a look in the, we can have a look in the documentation. Start the browser, go to the documentation, go to the user guide, and the process engine, and then Process Engine API, you get an overview of the services we have. Okay, so there's a repository service. This is basically meant for deploying processes, have a look which processes are deployed, and these kind of things. There's a task service in order to query tasks or to complete tasks. There's the runtime service, which is pretty important. This is for starting new process instances or make queries on running process instances. So basically, these are the most important ones already. There is the history service. We see that later on. If we walk through the BPMN process and we write some audit trail, all the timing, the audit trail goes to the history. And to access this, you have to use the history service. And there are a couple of others, like the identity service for users and groups, not that important. The form service for user forms, not that important as well, but we will have a look at that later on. And there's the management service for querying jobs and timers and these kind of things. We'll see them in the test case. And there's an authorization service for doing authorization. We will not tackle that at the moment, not that important. Okay, so these are the services. That's the service API you can use. So in order to start a new process, I use the runtime service, right? And now let's have a look what the runtime service can do for you. So what we always recommend is to have a look in the code completion or Java doc. So that should give a pretty good idea of what's possible there. So for example, I can send them some messages. We'll use that in the BPMN chapter. I can load variables from processes. I can delete variables. I can set them. I can tell the engine then I received a BPMN signal. And this is actually what I search for. I can start new process instances. And now that's a trap, actually. What you have to do is you select start process instance by key. Okay, because that's important. And this is simple. If you specify start process instance by ID, what it wants to have is the primary key of the process definition in the database. You actually don't know this here because you deployed the simple BPMN, so it goes to the database. There you have a process definition, but you don't know the ID of the process definition. And actually, in this case, you don't care. So if you wanna address that process by its ID, this one, you have to say start process instance by key, and this starts this process in the latest version, in the most current one. We see version name later on as well. Okay, so this starts already a process. Let's check that. It should actually work. Started as a unit test, and we have a green bar. So far, so good. So we started a process, and it has ended immediately. This is something actually we can check. So we process instance, we remember the process instance, and we can ask, for example, the history service. Get history service, create historic process instance query. So what we do very often is we work with these query API things. So this is a Fluent API to query information from the engine. So you don't have to do any SQL yourself. It's basically the query API. So I want to have a historic process instance query. And now I can make some conditions. So I can say only for the process instance ID, process instance get ID. Okay, I could make some more stuff here, but I don't need that actually. I should only have one. And now you have two possibilities. You can either query a whole list of process instances. It should actually be just one, so I say single result. What I get is a historic process instance. And that one I can now assert equals or assert true. That's maybe better. I can say historic process instance. So now you can see that's basically like a DTO you get. So it's basically a data container. of your historic process instance. So you get a lot of information from here, like the duration, the end time, the start time, and these kind of things. A lot of things you don't get from the runtime. So all the dates you get from the history. And now we do, there is no is ended, right? Okay, so we say if it's assert not null, so we want to have an end time. Yep. So this is really ended. All right, so we can check that. We run the unit test. And what you can see is it's really not much overhead. So you have a quick turnaround. You can try out anything you want here, click on the rerun test, and that's it. It's pretty fast, actually. So that's really nice to get started with the API and BPMN. That's actually already good groundwork. If we look at unit tests, yeah, there is something which is really interesting. There's the so-called Camunda BPM assert project. It's a community extension. So an extension basically means that it's contributed by the community and maintained by the community. So it's not part of the supported product, and there's no guarantee that we develop that further. So it's a bit more weak than the core product. But this one is actually really good, and it's already pretty stable. So this is something we can leverage. So basically I add that dependency as well. Wait a second, and then we can write the unit test even nicer. So we do the assert. My version is currently 1.0. Maybe you have a newer version later on. Sorry, I want to have that on test scope. Now I can go to my test case. And there's something really nice. Now you can use some assertions. So we could say something like assert. We copied that actually. So, right. So I could do something like assert that process instance has end. That should work. So that. So we have to do a static import. Somehow Eclipse doesn't recognize that automatically all the time, so I do it like that. And it should not be. Started is correct. Started was correct. We have Fluent API, so we can make a lot of asserts here, and we say it's ended as well. So we actually don't need that one anymore. It should still work, right? Still green. So that's actually pretty nice stuff. Okay, what it basically does in the background, it uses the engine as well to query the stuff from the history, but it already translates it in these assertions. So for test cases, that's really recommendable to use that assertion project. Okay, so let's keep it like that. What I want to do now is I actually want to extend the process. So I want to add stuff here, and yeah, normally maybe we would do a test first approach, but I think it's easier to follow if I do the BPMN file first. So let's start with maybe a user task. Okay, so I add a user task. I normally have a naming convention here, and I recommend to use one. So we could have a user task as part of the idea, and so do something user task. Actually not really creative at the moment, so I want to assign this to a group which is called management. Okay, first user task, very nice. We can check that. What happens to my test case actually? It should fail, right? Right, it does, because the process instance is not ended. Okay, it should be ended, but it's not. Right. So let's get the test screen again. I started the process instance. I can assert that this process instance has a task. I can even use that ID to say, okay, this task should be there. This actually one of the reasons why readable ID is really recommended. The second reason is that this ID you see in some parts in database sometimes. So it's really, really a good idea to have that readable. So I say this task should be there. It should be assigned to the management group. So we can check what we can do here. Has candidate group management. Okay. So that's actually pretty fine. I show you the task API for a second. So if I go to the process engine, I can say get task service this time. And now let's see what we can do here. So we can, for example, we can complete tasks. We can add some comments or these kind of things. We can delete a task. We get variables for tasks and so on and so on. So we change the priority, the owner, and whatever. Some of the stuff we will see. Some of the stuff best explore yourself. If you have any questions, ask either in the forum, or if you're enterprise user, ask via support, or look in the Java doc. Should be easy to figure out actually. For the moment here, I want to do a task query. Okay. I can, for the task query again, I can make some restrictions here. So I want to have only the one for candidate group. I think it's called task candidate group, right? Management, and give me a list. So these are my tasks. I can make an assertion that this should be exactly one task. And where's the problem here? Do I need some import or what is, yeah. Okay, that works. And I could do something like assert equals. Okay, that's actually a bit boring and maybe it doesn't make too much sense to test. And I cannot even test it like that because I don't have the group here. It's a bit more advanced why I don't have the group here. I want to skip that for now, but it could do something like that. Yeah, whatever. Some checks. Okay. This is actually the API you use if you build your own task list, like in your own UI or your own REST or web service or whatever. Then you use the task service. For test cases, I think it's pretty convenient to stick to the assertions you have here because that basically does the same in the background. It queries for that task, checks if it's there. If it's there, it makes some assertions. So it's basically the same stuff. The next thing I want to do is I want to simulate that the task was done and I move on. So I go again to the process engine. I get the task service. I complete a task, and I need the task ID, which I can get from the task we just queried. Okay. And now actually my test should be fine again, because after the completion, the process moves on and should be ended, right? Okay, let's try that. Worked. Okay. So that was the next step in our small process. Now we can make it a bit more interesting and we add an exclusive gateway. The exclusive gateway is an XOR gateway. So basically you have to decide if you either go that way or if you go another way. So we use that too. And we decide on, I make it simple, a bigger than 5 question mark. So that's the decision we want to make. And on this outgoing flow, we want to have yes and no. Makes sense. We have to tell the engine how to evaluate that. So we do that by using the condition in expression language. So expression language always looks like this. And in the yes case, we say A. A should be a process variable. We will hand the process variable in a second in the test case. So A should be bigger than 5, right? And in this case, I do the other way around. I say A smaller or equals 5. Okay. That's this. So my test case, actually, what do you think? What happens in the test case? You get a runtime exception because during runtime you want to evaluate a property A, and this cannot be resolved. It's neither a Spring Bean nor CDI Bean nor anything nor process variable. So it's just the runtime problem. Okay. So we want to hand in A. And this can be done, what we use in Camunda for process variables. Maybe we can switch back to the slides. Yeah, you saw the services already. We're using a map, basically, like a Java util map. So we don't model the process variables. That's important to know, because BPMN is capable of modeling data items. So I could do something like I want to have an A in my process. We can model this. The engine doesn't have any problems with it, but it's not used for execution. So we simply ignore it in the process engine. So it's just documentation. And this was a very, yeah, it was a decision we made because we are using a map approach. So you can store whatever you like all the time in the process, and you can read it anywhere, and you can change it or delete it. So you don't have to model it. You don't have to model input, output in service tasks or user tasks. Okay, the map is just there. The map is persisted with the process instance. So as soon as the process instance is stored in the database, you will see the data there as well. You can use all primitive types. You can use date or string. So we have own columns for that. So they are stored really in a relational database correctly. If you use other Java objects, it's possible if they are serializable. Then we store them at the byte array as a blob in the database. It's actually not a really good idea to do that. So if you can avoid it, better avoid it. So the rule of thumb is not many data in the process instance. So maybe only an ID, and the order is somewhere stored somewhere else. So the less data in the process context, in the process variables, the better. If you want to exchange serialization, that's actually possible. So you could exchange the default serialization to not use byte arrays, but to use JSON or XML. You have to do that yourself. That's basically configuration in the process engine. We're working on JSON and XML serialization as well. So maybe that's a configuration property in some future version. And then if you have process variables, you can use them in expression language. Pretty straightforward. So what we have to do in this case, we have to add A to the process. And let's say the user task should do that. So when you complete the user task, if you look at the method, there's a second signature where you can add some variables. So that's basically a map, as I said. So I create a new hash map. And I say put A, and this should be 3. So long. Okay, and let's check that. It should work. Actually, back to green bar. What we didn't yet do is we didn't assert it on which activity, on which end event we arrived. So we can check that as well. Has passed, I think, is the easiest one. I'm not sure there's a better one. I think has passed is good. And I give the end event some IDs. No bigger 5. Or let's make it a better example. Success. Maybe that's the success part. And that's the failed part. So what I can do is it should be 3. 3 is smaller, so it should be failed actually, right? Let's check that. Fine, worked. We could have added the variables during starting the process instance as well. Sorry. Okay, so we can add some variables here as well. That depends actually on the process design, but it's important to understand that for the moment. Make sense? I hope so. Okay, let's add something else here. What can we do? We could add a timer actually, because that's always interesting. We can have a, that's actually something I can never remember. Is it throwing or catching? Because I think you could argue for both. If you're unsure about BPMN construct, the best is to look in the reference, in the BPMN2 reference online. There you have the whole BPMN specification. Everything which is orange is actually supported by the engine. Everything which is gray is not yet supported, or maybe not supported. This one will never be supported. Doesn't make any sense, for example. So I can check, and there's a catching error event. Sorry, timer event, but there's no throwing. So I'm catching the time basically. Make sense? So we use a catching one. We have a timer, and we say, okay, the timer is 1 hour. We have to configure it. So we give him a duration of period time 1 hour. Okay, you have some hint here. It's ISO 8601. If you want to know about ISO 8601, I think Wikipedia is the best source actually. There you have a lot of information about that, so that's easy. The interesting thing is that I don't want to wait for 1 hour in my unit test, right? So how can I do that? And there are basically two options now. The first is, okay, first of all, the unit test should fail again because I don't end up in the end event. Okay, that worked. So first of all, I show you the API. So if I go to my process engine, say get management service. This time we use the management service because the timer in the background creates a so-called job for the job executor. We tackled that in the thread and transaction module. So I can query for that job actually. I say I want to have only active ones, makes sense. And I could query for the job type, so it could be only timers, but actually it should only be one. Don't care about that at the moment, so it should be a job. Has served true, I think, and I can do job. What can we do here? I get job type, maybe that's interesting, and this should be, we have a constant for that job. I think it's actually not sure. That's the cool stuff about this. I mean, you're very quick, so we can check. Was timer intermediate transition? Okay, we maybe don't want to check the time. But what we want to do is actually we want to trigger the timer being due, because management service execute job ID, because we don't want to wait for an hour. Okay, so we basically via API we tell them, okay, now please execute that timer. I know it's not you. I mean that I don't care actually, but I want to execute it now. That's exactly what the job executor will do when the time is due. So it's basically the same stuff. And this simulates that the timer expired. And what happened here? Why is that the case? That makes sense because what I did, I queried for job definitions. Actually, that was nonsense. I want to query for jobs. Okay, that makes more sense. And then I can limit that to timers. That's actually what I searched for. Sorry for that. I hope you recognize. Okay, so I have a job. Now I should be able to execute it. And my test should be green. Fine. Okay. That's actually important to get the idea. So if I have these timers or asynchronous continuation, like a service task with asynchronous continuation, I want to simulate that. There's, if we go back, oh, sorry, if we go back to the assertions, where was it? Then you can do that for jobs as well. Okay, so there is some help for jobs. So you don't have to use the full-blown API. Okay, let's do something else to get in touch with the API a bit more. There's something which is really interesting as well. So we can wait in a process, we can wait for messages. So that's an intermediate message event. There we can configure for which message we want to wait. That might be message, I don't know, something. Okay. Same thing as with arrows. This one is configured for the whole process definition, so I have to select it for this special message. Okay, so that means if a bigger than 5, I wait here till I get that message. Let's check that. Basically do a new test case. So this was the failed path. This was the success path. Same stuff here. But I have to add in like 6, for example. This one doesn't make any sense. We want to end up in the success end event. And it will not happen because we are still stuck in the message event, right? So the success part is not ended. Do that via the API. So the runtime service. You have basically 2 possibilities. The first is you say you received a message. That's a message something. And then you have to target it to an execution. The execution is an internal concept that you have to know it's somewhere in the API. So for a process instance, it might be that you have parallel paths, so you have multiple executions at the same time. So it maps a bit to tokens in the BPMN2. So yeah, think of it like multiple executions within one process instance. So I have to find the right execution waiting for that message. And that one I have to search. I can do that via the runtime service as well. So there's an execution query. Let's say for the current process instance, I want to have the one which waits for message something. The thing on itself. Execution. And this one is used here. Right. So this should actually work. Nice. It does. Now this, yeah, you have to know a bit about internals, about executions, and you might argue that this is a bit messy. You don't care about executions in that case, and you're probably right. So there's a second possible way, which is a recommended one from 7.1 on. You can create a message correlation for the message something. Okay. This might even start a process instance. That's interesting as well. We might have a look at that in a minute. And then I can make some correlation conditions. So for example, in our case, we want to correlate on the process instance ID. Just pretty straightforward. And that's it. I mean, that's much more readable, right? You could have some conditions on the variables. So you can say, okay, I want to send this message to the process instance with a variable order ID of value, whatever, 777. So this does some correlation in the background. Let's check that. Should run as well. Fine. Okay, so this is our message. What I said earlier, messages can be used to start a process instance as well. So I can add a message here. This might be the message start. Okay, so, and then we might go to maybe to that timer. Okay. Doesn't make a lot of sense in that case, just to show what's possible here. So making a test case for that. Test message start. There I can say, we do that as well. Process engine, get runtime service, create message correlation, message name, message start, correlate. Then we can ask the process engine, runtime service, create process instance query, make a list, and we expect to have assert exactly one, right? Because we're in a test case here. Okay, that's it. So this should start the process. Let's quickly check that. Wait a second, I'll show you one thing more. Maybe not as a test case, not that. Nice to do for the process engine from the runtime service. You can ask the current state of the process instance as well. So there are two interesting options. So you can ask for the active activity IDs. Okay, so I hand in the process instance ID. I have to get that first. Process instance. Right. And we can, another thing which is really interesting, we can get the activity instance tree. That's actually the one you might want to use if you really want to get an idea what's going on in your engine. This is the one we use in Cockpit in order to visualize all the figures on the diagram. So that's pretty cool. Okay, let's start that. Okay, so that worked. I'm in the intermediate catch event. That's the one from here. Intermediate catch event makes sense. And that's why I actually like to have really readable IDs here, right? So it should be the whatever timer intermediate catch event, so it's more readable. And where was my console? And there you see, okay, this is my process instance, and this is currently in that intermediate catch event. We don't care about that too much for the moment. So it's only interesting to see that this might be used. Okay, so we basically tackled a lot of the things. I mean, now it gets more boring. You can do much more stuff now, like having all the BPMN elements. But we will go through a couple of them in other modules. So we saw the messages, we saw the timers. You can use signals, which are basically like these signal what do you say, signal guns, where you can see some kind of broadcast, right? Arrows, compensation, cancel. We will see that in other modules. Okay, let's do one last thing and then we're almost done. I want to add a service task here. And let's assume this service task is, oh no, it doesn't have to be asynchronous. Sysout something. And the easiest thing is adding a Java class here. So that's my sysout delegate. We make it a Java delegate. Right. This one should sysout something walking through activity. Now we have the execution get current activity name. Maybe that's more readable than the ID. With variables, and then we can ask him for variables. Execution get variables. Copy file name. Okay, I'm still in the default package, so that's pretty small. So that should work for that case. Let's check that. I'm actually leaving the path of unit tests a bit. It's no longer a good testing practice what I do here. That works, and I see my walking through sysout something with no variables. We can quickly add variables. That variable hello world. Let's see if that works. Okay, now I have the data in there. Pretty straightforward as well. If you use something else like Spring or CDI in order to have your delegate wired, you might have something like sysout, right? And now we're going back to testing. I maybe don't want to start up a whole CDI container in order to have my sysout delegate ready here. Maybe with Spring that's pretty straightforward, but with CDI it's a different story, or at least we don't want to do it. There is at least some support you get here, so you can use so-called mocks object we have and register for an expression sysout. We can register our delegate, for example. Okay, the only thing we have to make sure is that the mocks some testing configuration is used. Let's check if that's already the case. It's not, right? Cannot resolve sysout. So we have to do something here about our process engine configuration. So what you always can do, that's actually pretty cool, test, I call it my test process config extend standalone process engine configuration. To be static, no, private class, what's that? Yeah, yes. So we can run that. And then we can override the constructor. And there we do something. We do say expression manager. And this should do the trick here, right? What I basically did now, I exchanged the expression manager. The expression manager is basically responsible to configure the expression resolving. So in our case, we still look in the process variables, but we look in that mock EL resolver, that's new. And this basically helps us here in order to use that mocks. What I could do now is I don't have to provide the class, but I could provide like a mock from Mockito. Okay. Don't want to do that at the moment because it consumes a bit more time. But Mockito is something we use in a lot of projects and we can recommend very much here. So that was it. So I hope you got an idea about the API, how we use that. Play around with it yourself. You see it's not a big overhead. Play around with BPMN yourself. It's not a big overhead as well. So you can get really familiar with that easily. If you have concrete questions about the API, ask in the forum, ask in the support, ask in our live meetings. I'm pretty sure we get that going. One last thing to wrap it up for testing. So we look back in the slide. What we currently tackled is something we have here as the scope 1. So we currently tested the smallest scope. We have the process model. We have the Java delegates attached to it because the Java delegates basically reads data, converts data, do the transformation. So logically, it really belongs to the process model. And we check all the expression language we have and these kind of things. So this is a pretty good scope to test actually. But we do it in memory. So with the in-memory database, we do it single threaded. So no job executor is running. That's important. So we don't have to wait for another thread to continue the asynchronous service task, for example, but we do that ourselves with the management service. And we don't want to have a container like JBoss or Tomcat to be required, because that makes the test really fast. And by doing so you really have test cases which are easy to handle and which can be executed all the time. Okay, and that really makes sense. So that's the scope we tackled. We don't have a look at the other scopes yet. So you might test a bigger scope where you use an EJB container, where you use JPA entities, these kind of things. There it might make sense to use frameworks like JBoss Erkilian or others to not set up your own testing environment, but using an environment you already have. And you might want to have the biggest scope where you really make end-to-end tests with the user interface, maybe with external systems, you really click it through. That's normally the scopes we tackle in the projects. Going for one really makes sense, at least in the first steps. As a homework, I want you to play around with it. We don't have a special assignment. Create a project, create a BPMN file, create a test case for it, and play around with it. Use a couple of different elements and see how it behaves, and yeah, play around with it. It's really fun. If you have any questions, let us know. Thank you for listening. See you next time.